Hello everyone, me again. This is the video for chapter 10, and chapter 10 is kind of continuation of the end of chapter 9 with the whole changes of the market revolution and the politics that come out of it. So we talked about the wars of 1812 and all the changes that it caused, and now chapter 10 is kind of going more into that. But one thing that happens is that because of the popularity that Andrew Jackson received due to his part in the War of 1812, he becomes a war hero, and it's later helps him to become president, basically. And a lot of interesting things happen because of that. So, first of all, if you see in chapter 10, the second slide is a picture of Andrew Jackson on the $20 bill. He is currently still on the $20 bill. He's supposed to eventually be replaced by Harriet Tubman. It hasn't happened yet, but it should. It's supposed to, because it was voted and approved. But here's the ironic thing about Andrew Jackson being on the $20 bill. First of all, he hated paper money. He thought it was too hard to control, that the value of it fluctuates too much, that you really can't regulate it, or they couldn't at the time. So he didn't like paper money. And the second thing that's ironic that he is on the $20 bill is that he did not like a national bank. He hated a national bank. In the 1790s, he lost money, and he blamed it on the first national bank that was created. So it's very ironic, and I wonder what he would have thought about being on the $20 bill, because he hated paper money and he hated the national bank. So coming out or during this market revolution, politics are changing a bit. It's called the era of the common man, although Andrew Jackson was very much from the common man. He was very wealthy and still part of the elite society, but he was the common man or whatever. So coming out of this, you get a lot of things happening. There's expansion of the right to vote, so more and more people are getting the ability to vote, although it's mostly still white males above a certain age. And most of them are property owners, though that's not always a stipulation in every state now. So more and more men are having the right to vote. So it's changing the shape of politics that comes out of it. And the election of 1824 is one of those that shows that. And the stuff that happens during the election and with the rise of Andrew Jackson, you get the second two-party system happening as well. Stop that. So, in 1819, there had been an economic depression. Once again, land values go down, all kinds of stuff happening. People couldn't make payments on the land and the house they bought, so they were losing land and houses and things like that. So lots of stuff is happening. There's a lot of uncertainty going on in the U.S. at the time. The election of 1824 opens up kind of some interesting issues. So, with this election, there's kind of there's five that or more than that take part in the election. The three ones who have the most votes are Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, and William H. Crawford. Henry Clay had received fourth place, so he wasn't being looked at for president. There was no majority. So now, once again, it's up to Congress to decide who becomes president, with the House, choosing. So Henry Clay urges the Congress to vote for John Quincy Adams. So John Quincy Adams becomes president over Andrew Jackson, although Andrew Jackson had received most of the votes, but not a majority of the votes. So he doesn't become president in the 1824 election. He calls this a corrupt bargain, and he vows revenge for this to happen. And because of this whole election and the problems that happen with it, that's the rise of the second two-party system. And it is Jackson's followers. They start to call themselves Jacksonians. And it's Jacksonian Democrats. Once again, Jacksonian democracy is what they were called. So, with that going forward, the election, the 4 years go on. John Quincy Adams, he does some things, some what he considers good things. But the election of 1828 rolls around after his 4 years, as first term. So Andrew Jackson runs for president again. And he has gained even more support since that first election. John Quincy Adams, not so much, because he was reliant on what he did as president. He thought, I did some good things. People are going to remember that I did good things, so I'll be elected president again. But Andrew Jackson, he goes on this huge campaign. He visits almost every state. I think he visits every state at the time. Gives speeches, goes to the people, rallies support, so on and so forth. Has barbecues and all these other different things. But he also introduces what we know as the modern day political system, where not only do you talk about the good things you're going to do, but you also talk about how bad your opponent is. And that's what he did. He starts to mudsling on John Quincy Adams during the speeches and things. So he was very popular for these things, but he was popular because of being the war hero. He was popular because he was from the West at the time. All kinds of different things, and a lot of people were just upset with how the country was going, that they thought that Adams and his followers were just elites and they were only promoting their own interests and so on and so forth. So the style of politics was changing. So because of this, John Quincy Adams, he loses the presidency and Andrew Jackson becomes president. When Jackson becomes president, 4 major things kind of happen during his presidency. He uses patronage to reward, his followers. When he comes into office, he gives his friends positions within government. Not that they would be good for the job, but just because, they helped him get where he was, so he gave them those positions. It causes some problems. Another thing, the nullification crisis. So before Jackson becomes president, while John Quincy Adams is president, there's a tariff that's being passed around. It's called the Tariff of 1828, but a lot of people call it the Tariff of Abominations because it sets an exceedingly high tariff on goods coming in. And Jackson was advocating for it, and it was a huge tariff. But he thought it wasn't going to pass. But he was just trying to stir up trouble during the ending of Adams' presidency. But unfortunately for him, it does pass. So this high tariff that he advocated for passed as Adams is leaving office. But now he's coming into office with this tariff being in place. So his supporters are very unhappy with this when he takes office. South Carolina, they start to really talk about this. And at the time, this doesn't cause much change, but they go through what's called a nullification crisis. So South Carolina is passing these things back and forth. They talk about it, and they basically say that states have the right to nullify federal laws within their own borders. Now, that's not true because, remember, federal law is supposed to be above state law. But they start to talk about that, and they start to pass around the idea that if the federal government becomes too large, you can secede from the union or whatever. So nothing really comes out at this point in the 1830s, but the ideas are being formed. And later on, when we get to the Civil War, it is South Carolina that becomes the first state to secede from the union. So these ideas are just taking place with this whole nullification crisis, as it's known. But it's overruled. Pretty much the Jackson and his Congress say, you cannot nullify a federal law. It's just not done. And they also passed a force bill saying that if need be, they can use the Army and Navy to put down any rebellions. Nothing really comes out of it at that point, just some tensions. That's what comes out. Now, when Jackson becomes president, he vows that he's going to end the Second Bank of the U.S. There are charters coming forward. It's wanting to be renewed. But he says, there's no way I'm letting this bank continue. So Congress is going to go ahead and renew the charter. But since he can't do away with it that way, so what he does is he withdraws all of the federal funds from the Bank of the U.S. and he takes that money and he puts it in the banks of all of his friends. So that essentially ends the bank because they have no money now. So the bank is forced to close, and now all the money's in these different banks, which causes some banks to be good. Some of the banks, they're doing very well because they have this federal funding. But other banks are forced to close now because the prominence of these wildcat banks. So it's called wildcat banking. So it creates kind of a monopoly on the banking system, and the banking system is not controlled by the federal government anymore. It's in private hands. So that actually pretty much puts a damper in the whole banking and financial system of the United States up until the ending of the Civil War. So Jackson caused a lot of problems with that whole thing. But for him, he considers a victory that he did away with the Second Bank of the U.S. Another controversial issue, though, that goes on during his presidency is the Indian Removal Act. So it's kind of back and forth on whether Andrew Jackson was just anti-Indian, anti-Native American, or not. Because while he was fighting the War of 1812, he used the aid of the Creeks to win the war. But then when the war's over, he pretty much helps force them off their land and make them sign an unfair treaty, giving away a lot of their rights. But at the same time, he adopts a Creek boy who didn't have any parents anymore. So he has an adoptive Creek son. But when he's president, he helps push forward the Indian Removal Act of 1830. What happens during this is that gold, of course, is found on, in particular, Cherokee land. The Cherokee Nation in particular, takes place. The Cherokee had been, of all the tribes in the United States, they were the one that becomes the most American. They adopt English, they adopt democracy, they have a legislative system very similar to the American system. Many of them own slaves, they have farming, they just adopt pretty much the American lifestyle without being called American. So they're very much American in nature. And they even had legislation by Congress that, presents them as a nation, as a Cherokee nation that has protections by the United States government, that they have control of their land and so on and so forth. But gold is found on their land later. And so all of that goes out the window. And this legislation is passed that, and Andrew Jackson says, it's for their protection that we must remove them, because if we don't, these settlers are going to come in and attack them in order to take their land and get this gold and so on and so forth. So we are protecting them by forcing them off of their land to a reservation. And that's pretty much what the Indian Removal Act does, is it takes them from their land in Georgia and removes them to Oklahoma. And along the way, federal officials are like, oh, it's, not that bad. Only a few died along the way or whatever. But the Cherokee are keeping their own records, and like thousands die along this journey, because part of it takes place in the winter, very cold, harsh, environment. They don't have, a lot of them don't have horses or wagons or things, so they must walk the whole way. And then the other part of the trip takes place in the summer, and they're not allowed to stop for water, and they don't have provisions, and some of them starve to death. It's a brutal process, and that's why it's called the Trail of Tears, is this section of history. But they're forcibly removed, even though they fight. They go all the way to Congress in this Supreme Court case called Worcester versus Georgia. But the Supreme Court upholds that they are a legitimate nation and they have the rights to their land and so on and so forth. But Andrew Jackson makes the controversial decision that he is not going to enforce that. That, in fact, he later on orders the troops to remove them. So he goes against the Supreme Court during this decision. So, and this is kind of a back and forth between Jackson and Congress. Throughout his presidency, he vetoes stuff that they do, and they just override his veto and back and forth. So lots of stuff happens. But eventually the Cherokee are pushed off their land during the Trail of Tears, where thousands died. And it kind of just reiterates, was he anti-Indian? Was he anti-Native American? Who knows? His idea, though, was that eventually they're going to become extinct anyway. The Native Americans are going to become extinct. So why not just help it along? Eventually their lifestyle will be gone. So let's just push that along quicker. Another thing he does that really does not help, in fact, hurts the economy and causes a depression that is very much similar to the Great Depression. He passes the Specie Circular in 1836 that says that the federal government will only accept gold and silver now to be used in the sale of lands and the payment of debts. So no more paper money, because he was anti-paper money. Well, I don't know about you, but not many people had gold and silver just laying around, so they couldn't pay their debts anymore. And so a lot of people lost their homes again and their farms because they didn't have gold and silver to pay the bills. And once again, a lot of people didn't have gold and silver to go buy land in the West, so sale of lands in the West went down. So it causes the Panic of 1837, one of the worst depressions. Like I said, it rivals the Great Depression, so it causes all kinds of problems. And once again, Andrew Jackson, he didn't admit that this was wrong or anything, but caused a lot of problems, and because of that he lost a lot of support going into it. So all these practices that he's doing, the ending of the National Bank and the Indian Removal Act and the Specie Circular and all the stuff he's doing, causes another party to form, and they call themselves the Whigs because they say that Andrew Jackson is acting like a tyrant and they want to do away with him. He thinks he's a king instead of a president. The Whigs, that was what the British Party called themselves, that went against the king in Britain because they said he was a tyrant. So the Whigs were formed in the United States saying they were going against a tyrant as well. So you get the two-party system of Jackson's Democrats versus the Whigs. And the Democrats, of course, were mostly for, westward expansion. They were for farmers, they said, and so on and so forth. And they said that the Whigs were part of the aristocracy, who were the merchants, bankers, financiers, and those people, and were trying to do away with that, and so on and so forth. But so you get this back and forth between the two groups. And of course, Andrew Jackson starts to be portrayed as a king and a tyrant, and he was called King Andrew I, and all of his practices. But you just get this head coming, or getting more issues coming to a head because of this. And so you get the Whigs versus the Democrats. And a lot of people started to support each one for different reasons. But that is pretty much chapter 10. And this just leads into more and more issues that start to take place and really snowball into the Civil War. And that's what we're picking up with when we get into chapter 11. More and more issues that start to take place and just eventually lead into that war that will end our semester. But this was chapter 10 and the last chapter that is covered for exam 2.